Thank you all for coming to this afternoon's panel on ocean acidification. This is an issue that I'm excited to be talking about. It's something we've been working on for a little while. So my name is Chad English. I work with Compass. We are an organization that really works to help scientists be active participants in policy dialogues, among other things. We see a lot of value that the academic community can bring to some of these conversations, and we try to help them sort of find their way out of the ivory tower into some of these conversations. And the two scientists we've got here are veterans at this, which is always fun for me. So ocean acidification is a fairly urgent issue for many, especially the people you're going to be hearing from today. It represents a fundamental shift in ocean chemistry, and it's something that's happening very much now. It's not something it's clearly something that will continue happening, but it's, as you're going to be hearing, it's something that's having very direct impacts on people's lives as we speak. There have been businesses that have been blindsided and nearly run out of business by ocean acidification, and you're going to be hearing some of that from Bill Dewey. And the fact that there are people who make their living out on and in the ocean and are beginning to see very direct impacts and are very concerned about this kind of raises the urgency, but also I think makes it all the more essential that we think a little bit harder about what the scientific community can be doing to help us understand what's coming. So I think there's a very big opportunity that I'm looking forward to discussing a bit more to help mobilize the state of the knowledge that we have now, as well as the science community, to help build the knowledge we need in partnership with those who live and breathe the ocean, to make sure that we don't continue to see communities and industries blindsided by an issue that seems to be moving very quickly. So you're going to be hearing from Dr. Dick Feely from NOAA, who's been in this game, as far as I can tell, forever. And he's the guy who he's spent enough time on the water that I think he knows. He's more familiar with the data than anybody else I know. Bill Dewey is going to be helping us understand really what this means to people who actually make their living on the water or from the water in some way. He's got over 30 years in the shellfish industry to draw from, and it's just a fantastic and very impassioned spokesperson I think you're going to enjoy hearing from. And Meg Caldwell from Stanford is a lawyer who's going to be really helping dive into the policy and legal levers that already exist to try to address some aspects of this issue and help us understand where the opportunities are to take action in the near future. Scott Doney, then, a scientist from Dewey, who I've had the pleasure of working with almost since my beginning at Compass, and I know Compass has been working with him before I came on the scene, way back in, 2004, 2005, has been a very active and very effective spokesperson on the issue, really trying to help share what the science community has with the rest of society and with policymakers. So, without further ado, I'm going to let Dick take the stand and share his piece, and the speakers will each introduce themselves briefly to give you a little more background on where they're coming from.
Well, thank you, Chad. It's really an honor to be here at HU in this policy forum and talk about something I've been particularly passionate about. I want to talk about what is ocean acidification, why our coastal oceans are particularly vulnerable to ocean acidification and other processes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts on marine organisms as a lead into what Bill will talk in more detail. Here's a perfect example of what ocean acidification is all about. The top record is the Mauna Loa station of CO2 measurements in the atmosphere. This was started by Dave Keeling in 1958. And underneath it in blue is the ocean time series data at Ocean Station Lois, the longest time series for ocean measurements. And what you can see is that the ocean accumulates CO2 at almost exactly the same rate as the atmosphere. And this is that direct relationship between the atmospheric content, which is increasing because of the burning of fossil fuel, coal and oil and natural gas, and its proportionate uptake by the oceans. And in the bottom plot here, I show you the pH as measured at the Aloha station. And as you can see from this data set that the pH is decreasing. It's decreasing at the rate of about 0.02 pH units per decade. And we have this now as observations throughout the global oceans, and this is repeated everywhere we look. Now, the chemistry of ocean acidification is really very simple. It's what you all learned in high school. So I know this is just a refresher for you. But CO2 is a gas that reacts with water, and it forms carbonic acid. Everyone here knows that because every time you drink a bottle of pop, you see the fizziness, which is that carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid then dissolves in water to form a proton, and the proton is what gives the ocean its acidity. That hydrogen ion provides the acidity of that ocean. One of the reactions of that hydrogen ion is with carbonate ion. Carbonate is particularly important because the shells and skeletons of many of our marine organisms, particularly our shellfish, are a form of calcium carbonate. So when that hydrogen ion consumes that carbonate ion, we are decreasing that carbonate concentration and therefore impeding the progress of shell generation. And this is one of the major impacts of ocean acidification that we'll be talking about. So the overall reaction then is CO2 entering the water, consuming the carbonate ion, and increasing bicarbonate. Now, over time, what we see is that the pH of seawater, because of the addition of over 2 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuel over the entire industrial period, has caused the surface ocean to drop in pH from a value of about 8.2 on average to about 8.1. Now, pH is a logarithmic scale, just like the Richter scale. So a tenfold change in pH would be a onefold change tenfold change in acidity would be a onefold change in pH. That's what to remember. So this pH drop of 0.1 is already a 30% increase in that hydrogen ion concentration, the acidity of the ocean. And the carbonate ion concentration has already dropped 16% since the beginning of the industrial period. What the IPCC projections out to the end of the century suggest to us is that the pH could drop another 0.3 or 0.4 pH units, which would be 100 to 150% increase in the acidity of the oceans by the end of this century. So this is the issue that's before us as scientists. There would also be a concomitant drop in the carbonate ion concentration of 50%. These are changes that the oceans haven't seen for more than 20 million years that would happen within the next century. Now, an important thing to know is that the pH of seawater is still basic. It's in the pH range, as I show here, between 8.1 and 8.2. It actually ranges, whole ranges from about 7.5 to 9 throughout the global oceans. And what we are saying is that the change towards acidic conditions, towards the neutral condition, is the direction of acidification. That's why we call it acidification, because it's moving in the direction of acidified water, even though the waters are still basic. The important thing is that the organisms have all evolved in this basic condition, a pH of about 8.1 or 8.2, and they are very sensitive to these changes moving in the direction of acidification. It's very important to understand that. And the kind of reactions that are impacted are the formation of calcium carbonate shells and skeletons, or clams and oysters and coral reefs. This is the reaction that they have, the calcium plus that carbonate forming calcium carbonate. So if we remove the carbonate ion concentration, it makes it more difficult to form their calcium carbonate shell. And we have a geochemical indicator of that process called the saturation state. And when the saturation state is greater than 1, precipitation can occur and often does occur. And usually the surface oceans have a saturation state somewhere between 2 and 6 for aragonite and between about 4 and 8 for calcite. So there's a tendency in the surface oceans to form these calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. Now, in the colder waters of the deep ocean or in the high Arctic regions, we can get to saturation states that are closer to 1, in which it's very difficult to form the shells, or even less than 1 when the shells begin to dissolve. And this little diagram here shows that for a pteropod shell that's in the left-hand corner, you can see the progress of dissolution that would take place in the northern oceans under conditions that we might expect to see in the near the end of the century. That dissolution can be completed within about 45 days or so. So it's a fairly fast reaction in the ocean. Now, here's the way we monitor CO2 throughout the oceans. We do large-scale surveys from ocean to ocean, from the Arctic to the Alaska, from east to west. We've done 99 cruises over the last decade, collecting 75,000. People like Scott Doney had lead many of these cruises, collecting samples from surface to bottom. So we know the chemistry extremely well. It's very well documented what the chemistry of the ocean, and this is what it looks like in terms of the contribution of anthropogenic CO2 in the waters. And what you see is that most of the anthropogenic CO2 here in red still resides in the upper 1,000 meters of the water column. More than half resides in the upper 500 meters, where all the organisms exist. And the penetration of that anthropogenic CO2 to the deeper part of the ocean takes thousands of years for that to be completed. And we can see a full circuit in about 2,000 of years. So consequently, most of this anthropogenic CO2 is still in the upper part of the water column where it has its impact. And until it makes that full circuit, the oceans can't neutralize all that CO2 that's being generated. And so what we can do then is we can determine where the regions were, where this saturation state is less than 1, where the corrosive waters will occur for dissolution to take place. And what we find is in the North Atlantic, it's still quite deep, about 2,500 meters or so. There's some parts of the South Atlantic where it's shallower, where a lot of respiration is taking place. And what we find is in the North Pacific, the oldest waters, we see that the corrosive waters are very shallow, about 200 meters or so, essentially sitting right near our shelf break, right at the edge of the shelf break. In Alaska, it's as shallow as 100 meters. So these are the regions that are going to be most vulnerable to acidification right now, and the addition of more anthropogenic CO2 is going to put us over the top. The waters are going to show and show and show until they reach the surface. And indeed, in the Arctic Ocean, they should reach the surface in the next 2 or 3 decades. Along our coast, we're seeing some evidence where they're reaching the surface during upwelling events. In the Pacific Northwest, we have an additional problem, is these waters that are against the continental shelf here can upwell in the summertime all the way to the surface and all the way to the beach. This is part of a normal upwelling process. So you have waters that are enriched, naturally enriched in CO2 because of natural respiration processes, having an additional accumulation of CO2 from the surface from man's activity, making these waters more and more corrosive with time, being upwelled to the surface, and impacting those coastal ecosystems right now. And we see this all the way from Canada to Mexico, and if we looked real hard, we'd be able to see that along South America as well. And this is what it looks like. Here's an example of some data we acquired from Canada and Mexico in 2007, and we see here in blue, we can see the corrosive waters in Northern California reaching all the way to the surface. We can see that when you get to a depth of about 125 meters or so, the entire bottom waters are all corrosive, so they're already impacting those benthic organisms with the very corrosive waters along our coast everywhere we look. And we can see it at various depth levels where there exists. But this upwelling process is very prominent from April to about November, and is already affecting our hatcheries and our shellfish beds in these regions. Now, and another additional complication in coastal regions is that when phytoplankton is produced, it settles to the seafloor, and when it settles to the seafloor, it's remineralized back to CO2. So this is the process of eutrophication, and if it becomes extreme, we call it hypoxia, where the phytoplankton is being consumed, it's using up all the oxygen, and it's producing CO2 in the process. So these additional eutrophication processes and hypoxic formation will add more CO2 to those bottom waters due to respiration. thus decreasing the pH even further. So our coastal regimes will be impacted by this process as well, and we have to take that in account. So that the processes that lead to high CO2 also lead to low pH and very corrosive conditions in these regions. In addition to that, we might expect that human impacts of the input of nitrogen and phosphorus compounds from rivers and coastal processes may add to the burden of phytoplankton and that hypoxic processes that again will lower the pH of those waters in local large embayments like Puget Sound, San Francisco Bay, Chesapeake Bay. And in fact, when we look in these regions, we find that the pHs of those waters are even lower than anything we see on our coast. In Puget Sound, it can get as low as 7.4 because of the local inputs of nutrients that enhance that respiration process and cause this significant impact. What do we do about this? Well, we have in the universities and within the federal laboratories have been studying acidification since the 1990s, and we have a number of different techniques that we employ. We do experiments in laboratory settings with instruments that allow us to look at individual species. We can do larger scale mesocosm studies. This is Biosphere 2, which is a coral reef system here, control the atmospheric CO2 concentration. Or we can do what the USGS does and other colleagues. They put tents over coral reef systems in the open ocean. We have a variety of different ways to look at this process, study the impacts, and see what impacts we might expect to see in the future. And here's one example of an impact on pteropods. Pteropods are marine snails. They're the primary food source for pink salmon in the Pacific Northwest during their early life stages. Much as 65% of the pink salmon's food source in the wintertime are these marine pteropods. And here's a 30-day experiment of the dissolution of the calcium carbonate shell at a PCO2 concentration of 1,100 microatmospheres. You can see extensive eroding of those shells in just 30 days. So what we are beginning to look at with the National Marine Fisheries Service and other groups is what the impact of that would be on the ecosystem as a whole. You can see that calcium carbonate forming phytoplankton like coccolithophorids would be eaten by copepods. The pteropods on the bottom would eat the coccolithophorids and other species. They produce calcium carbonate cells. The salmon prefer to eat the copepods and the pteropods. So anything that affects the lower part of the food chain would have an impact on the upper part of the food chain, and we can study these food chain dynamics thus far. Some of the early studies suggest that a 10% drop in the production of pteropods might cause as much as a 20% drop in the weight of mature salmon. So this is a very important issue for our marine fisheries. Some of the most important impacts that we have seen so far is, as I suggested, reduced calcification rate, significant shifts in key nutrient and trace element species. pH is one of these vital parameters that affect the chemistry of seawater because they interact with most of the chemical species in seawater. So a change in pH affects nutrients and trace metals, toxic trace metals. It might even affect impacts of harmful marine algae. All these would be affected by pH changes. There'd be changes in phytoplankton diversity and productivity. And usually the larval forms of species are much more sensitive than adults, so we have to look at the different life stages. There's reduced tolerance to other factors. For example, in a global warming world, the temperature increase combined with the CO2 increase appears to have more significant impact than either one of these parameters alone. There would be changes to fitness and survival. There may be changes in species biogeography. Certainly there would be food web changes. We are now seeing some latest indications that marine fishes get impacted by enriched CO2 in terms of their ability to navigate waters and their effects on sediment and recruitment, and even their ability to avoid being eaten can be affected by the concentration of CO2. So there are many, many issues that we're just getting our hands around and just beginning to appreciate the overall impacts on our global ecosystems. So what we know for certain is that the rising greenhouse gas emissions says there will be a rapid change in open chemistry out to 2100 with as much as 100 to 150% increase in the acidity of the oceans. That by 2100 we expect to see an increase in acidity somewhere between 100 and 150%. And that rate of change is faster than anything we have seen over the last 300 million years. And natural and other human factors, besides greenhouse gases, will contribute to the overall acidification effects. Thank you.
So my name's Bill Dewey. I work for Taylor Shellfish Farms in Washington State. Taylors have been in the business of growing shellfish out there since 1890. The fifth generation's involved in the company today. Grown to be, in the last couple decades, the largest producer of farm shellfish in the country. Clams, oysters, mussels, geoduck. And we, in recent years, have come to learn firsthand what some of the effects are of ocean acidification. So I wanted to share some of that experience with you. So this is a busy slide with a lot of numbers on it. And there's just a couple things I'd like you to pull away from it. These are production statistics for the farm shellfish on the west coast of the United States, and you can see that it's roughly $117 million a year industry, and the bulk of that comes from Washington State. It leads the country in farm shellfish production, and I'll talk just for a second about why that is. You can also see on this slide that oysters dominate. And that's significant as it relates to the ocean acidification problem, because as it turns out for us, that seems to be the species that's most greatly impacted for us. So one of the reasons that Washington leads the country in farm shellfish production ties back to some laws that were passed in 1895 that allows for the sale of tidelands into private ownership, specifically for the purpose of farming shellfish. They're called the Bush Act and the Callow Act, and there's roughly 47,000 acres of tidelands in Washington that were sold under these laws to encourage shellfish aquaculture to try to replenish, at that time, what was a wild fishery for our native oyster that was depleting it. It was very effective, and that private ownership has given us the stability we need and capital we can take to the bank and borrow money against and so on. Where in other states, if you want to farm shellfish, you need to lease that land from the state. And a lot of times banks aren't so willing to loan money for that when you're leasing and so on. So anyhow, this is just one example. This is a bay in northern Puget Sound, and all those lines out in the bay are anywhere from 10 to 100 acre tracts of tidelands that are in shellfish culture, and many other bays in the state would have similar maps like this. So just real quickly to show you some of the investment and infrastructure involved in farming shellfish there in Washington with oysters. This is some photographs of our seed production, all for the most part hatchery-based seed production. The larvae in the upper left are introduced into tanks that you see in the lower right that are filled with oyster shells and heated seawater. Those larvae swim around attached to the shells within about 24 hours, and then those pallets of seed are taken out to nursery areas and put in the bay for a few months before they're planted. This is just an example of a crop of oysters about 4 years later that's reached maturity and is ready to harvest. A lot of our oysters, most of our oysters in Washington State are grown there just directly on the bottom. This is in areas where the ground's too muddy to support the oyster crop. We support the crops up on PVC pipe stakes. We call these oyster long lines, another method of growing the oysters. Harvesting, we work our farms there at low tide, big low tide, high and low tide differences there in the West Coast, and so we typically will have anywhere from a 3 to 5 hour window to work on our farms when the tide's out. That's when the harvesting and farming practices take place. Tide comes back in, we retrieve those baskets full of oysters and bring them into the processing plant for processing. This is actually my farm. Besides working for Taylor's on the weekends and in my spare time, I grow clams, and this is a picture from my farm up in northern Puget Sound, rows of manila clams. All the pallets in the background there all have about 1,000 pounds of clams on them. We've just finished doing some harvesting there. Geoduck clams is a species that we've been farming for the last 20 years or so, one of our more exciting species and valuable species in recent years. So in the mid-2000s, we started to experience problems with our seed production, and a lot of the initial effort was attributed to this naturally occurring Vibrio bacteria that kills the oyster larvae. A lot of effort and money expensed invested in filtering that Vibrio tubiaceae out of the hatchery water, only to find out at the end of the day that our larvae were still dying. And trying to figure out what might be causing that, we started to look more closely at the seawater chemistry. And about that time in 2008, Dick Feely came and was the keynote speaker at our Shellfish Growers Conference and basically gave that same talk that he just did. And I came to the conference a little bit late. I missed his talk, and I walked into a room full of some very long faces. As these people, it's like somebody just been told somebody died or something. So it was just a sad story. And basically, they just been told that the reason their seed is not available or the larvae are dying is because of these conditions in the ocean. And Dick was nice enough to put the exclamation point on and saying, oh, by the way, even if we can't convince the world to stop emitting carbon, these waters are 50 years old, so the problem is going to get worse for 50 years before it gets better. So not a very optimistic message for shellfish growers. Since then, a lot of the attention has obviously shifted towards ocean acidification and a lot of energy into research and monitoring, which has been incredibly helpful. This is showing where the West Coast hatcheries are. Shellfish are very prolific. It doesn't take many hatcheries to supply the whole West Coast industry. Our hatchery, the Taylor hatchery there on the Hood Canal, is one of the large ones. And then the Whiskey Creek hatchery on the Oregon coast. We're the two that have experienced the greatest difficulties with these corrosive seawaters. The others, for various reasons, haven't experienced the same losses that we have, and we're all trying to learn from each other as to why that might be. As Dick explained, we have this phenomenon with upwelling on the west coast there. When we get north winds, those deep ocean waters that are corrosive come up and into the hatchery intakes and effectively dissolve our larvae. So this just shows what happened to us. Our worst year in our hatchery, which is depicted in the lower right, was in 2008 and 2009, when effectively our production was off by 60 and 80% respectively. In the Whiskey Creek hatchery on the Oregon coast, their production declined precipitously as well. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, that's a picture of healthy oyster larvae. In the lower left, you can see the difference between larvae that have been grown at a good pH versus a corrosive pH, how the larvae shells dissolve there. Our bars, the graph on the right, lower right, is a little confusing because we were doing things at the same time our production was declining. We were trying to offset those losses by increasing our production capacities. So the white bars within the blue bars indicate efforts to expand our larvae production capacity to try to offset those losses. And we've also been fortunate that we have another hatchery facility in Kona, Hawaii. So at the same time we ramped up our research and monitoring efforts at our Hood Canal hatchery in Daybob Bay, we expanded our production in Kona, where we haven't experienced the same losses, to try to counter that as well. We've been fortunate with the monitoring and research that's been going on. We've been able to learn how to dodge these corrosive water events. Thanks to Senator Caldwell in 2010, she secured an appropriation that has really helped the industry out. We've been able to buy some very sophisticated real-time CO2 monitoring equipment for the hatcheries, and essentially it's been like putting headlights on the car. We can see this corrosive water coming at the intake pipes, and we can figure out ways to dodge it. At our hatchery, we have two different intakes, a shallow intake at 15 feet and a deep water intake at 100 feet. With the monitoring equipment, we can see we've got pH of 7.5 and CO2 levels of 1,200 down here at 100 feet, and we've got pH of 8.2 and CO2 levels of 390 here at 15 feet. And it allows us to choose which intake to produce on. The Whiskey Creek hatchery in Oregon, similarly, when they get the north winds, they've learned that they've got about a 24-hour window before that corrosive water ends up at their intake pipe, so they fill their tanks like crazy and just try to do their spawning and production around these corrosive water events. So this is through NANUS, which is one of the IUS, the Northwest IUS program, essentially the Integrated Ocean Observing System program. We have our hatchery intake data up live on their website, so you can go there and click on the icon at our hatchery and see right now, today, what those CO2 and pH levels are at our hatchery. So one of the other things we've learned through the research is that the early life stages are the most vulnerable. So the first 2 to 3 days of a shellfish, of an oyster's life, it's using amorphous calcium carbonate that dissolves extremely readily. And then it transitions to aragonite, which is still dissolves easily, but not as much. And then as they metamorphose in their plankton phase and begin their life on the bottom, they transition to calcite, which is quite a bit hardier. So we've also learned, we have hope that in the hatchery, if we can manipulate the seawater chemistry and produce the larvae, that once we get the shellfish out on the beds, we can still successfully grow our industry. But figuring out how to address the seed problem in the hatchery is really key. So, and this, I've already talked about this, how this is the Whiskey Creek hatchery, learning how to manage around the corrosive events as that water's coming into the intake pipe. They've also learned, they used to come into the hatchery at 8 o'clock in the morning and flip the switch and fill the tanks and begin their work for the day. And they've learned now with the monitoring equipment that if they wait until 3 o'clock in the afternoon and let the phytoplankton do their thing out in the bay with photosynthesis throughout the day, that if they flip the tanks on pumps on at 3 in the afternoon, they can get much better quality water into the hatchery just by waiting until later in the day. So things like that we've learned to adapt and recover a lot of our production. So as I started my talk with the canary, I just try to drive this point home, and Dick has already alluded to it when he talked about what some of the other potential impacts are to species in the ocean. But of the $4 billion in $4 billion in ex-vessel revenue that the U.S. commercial fishing generated in 2007, 3/4 of those came from animals that need calcium carbonate or fish that prey directly on calcifiers. So when you think about what that means to our food supply and food security in the country, people should be concerned about ocean acidification. So Washington State has stepped up. We've been very excited. Governor Gregoire, as part of the Washington Shellfish Initiative, earlier this year seated a Blue Ribbon panel on ocean acidification, and Dick Feely's on that, as am I, and Senator Ranker here from Washington State as well, and trying to take the lead in the country and set an example on looking at this problem and what we can do individually in Washington State that can maybe affect some change, whether it be monitoring, adaptation, nutrient mitigation, things that we can do on a local scale at the state level that make a difference. And I don't like to end on too negative a note and think that there's nothing that can be done. We're trying to think positively here and think that there are solutions, and I don't want Kevin going out of the room screaming here. So, like he did at the first ocean acidification Blue Ribbon panel, and he's just like, it's hopeless, we have to give up. And so, no, Kevin, no. So there are things, and some of these are big and some of them not so big. Some of these we can affect on a local level, and some of them we need to deal with nationally and internationally when it relates to the fossil fuel emissions. But even there, there are things that we can do locally that will make a difference. So I'll end there and pass the baton to Meg.
So as the sole lawyer on the panel, it's my job to offer hope, if you can believe it. Rarely do you hear that from a lawyer, right? So it is my honor to be on this panel and be sandwiched between all of these incredible scientists and practitioners. I work at Stanford University and happen to direct a center that's called the Center for Ocean Solutions. And our job is to tackle the biggest problems facing the ocean and develop some transformational solutions. That's all. And so we work in interdisciplinary teams, and I'm delighted to say that one of my postdocs is here, Ryan Kelly, who's been working on the topic of ocean acidification and what we can do about it with me for the last couple of years. He was supporting me when I served on the ORAP, Ocean Acidification Task Force, a couple of years ago. And it was there that I met Dick Feely on this topic, and we got our heads together about what a lawyer might be able to offer in the way of some potential solutions. So let's just get right into it. As you know, we have some major sources of CO2 emissions globally and nationally and locally. The way we produce our energy, coal-fired plants among them, has very high CO2 emissions. Our transportation system, as it is today, produces great CO2 emissions, and deforestation is certainly contributing to the global problem. But as you know, we're not making a lot of headway at the national or international level in dealing with our CO2 emissions. So the question arises, how do we deal with that perhaps at a subnational level, and can that help the oceans? Dick already showed this slide. This comes from an article for which Ryan Kelly was lead author, And here we really tried to graphically portray all those different potential sources of localized ocean acidification and pointed the way towards using existing laws and policies to address each one of these sources. We know from some studies that have been done in the likes of Casco Bay in Maine, in the Chesapeake Bay, in Australia, and in Puget Sound now with the Blue Ribbon Task Force work, that we can see up to 50% of the local acidification coming from local sources. So that really gives us an opportunity to take action locally and try to buy time against this global long-term problem. Also build some resiliency in our coastal ocean so that the ecosystems can better withstand the power of an increasingly acidifying ocean from CO2 emissions. I think that, and this is one of Dick's graphics, which he didn't show, a different form of it perhaps, which really highlights these hot spots in our coastal areas here along the western, or on the left coast, along the western seaboard of the United States. And we know that we see these hot spots, but there's a great deal of diurnal variability in the pH that is showing up. So a great deal of natural variability, if you will, in pH measurements. We know that the impact of these non-CO2 local drivers is likely to differ quite a bit spatially from one region to another. And accordingly, we think that you'll want to know your local ocean in order to know which of these law and policy levers or tools you want to use to address these local drivers of ocean acidification. That suggests that really what you want to do is develop some kind of source budget, if you will. But the initial, I think, instinct for many of us, and we've certainly gotten a lot of calls from various legislators, national, from Congress and from the state, should we pass a law? What do we need to do? Do we have to come up with an ocean acidification mitigation law? And our answer is, well, let's first look at what we've got on the books and see how far we can get in addressing these potential local sources with existing laws. The Clean Water Act actually holds out a great deal of promise. If you look at everything from water quality criteria and how we might adjust the type of water quality criteria that we're using, how we might use the TMDL process if you've got an impaired water body where you're exceeding the national water quality criteria or the state water quality criteria, what can be done to address these local sources. And if you develop what we call a source budget, where you're actually identifying what the predominant sources of your local acidification is coming from, then you're able to identify which of these levers you're going to use. Clean Water Act is also something that you can use in terms of identifying the appropriate beneficial uses. There are states that actually have beneficial uses identified as shellfish production, and that gives you yet another tool through the Clean Water Act to address these local sources. The Coastal Zone Management Act, of course, is our primary vehicle for addressing non-point source pollution, and many states take a sort of more voluntary approach to managing non-point source pollution, but it's within their discretion to take a much more proactive and active enforcement approach if they like. So most states are using the carrot approach, but they can use the carrot and the stick approach to address non-point source pollution like coastal erosion or some forms of agricultural runoff. Local land use laws and policies give us a handle on coastal development for shore, road construction, and other forms of non-point source pollution. And the Clean Air Act is the way that we typically address our emissions, CO2 emissions for sure, but also SOx and NOx. And that is a problem, for example, in the Chesapeake Bay region, where we know that up to 50% of the localized acidification is coming from SOx and NOx. So we have a lot of tools in our tool chest, and some of them, like the Clean Water Act, are actually quite efficient because we can even use the Clean Water Act to address air emissions, SOx and NOx, for example. That is being done in the Chesapeake Bay region. What we've done at the Center for Ocean Solutions is we've started compiling these, our analysis of these various laws and describing exactly how they could be deployed to address particular local causes. And the report, the cover of which you see on the far right of this slide, is a special report that we've put out for the state of California that is just published and on our website. And it goes in great detail about how one could think about using our existing laws in California. Similarly, we have another report that we've done that comes in the form of a law review article for the nation as a whole, and my final slide will include that URL where you can access the law review article, because I know you're all dying to read a 42-page law review article. But before we go there, I think it's important to acknowledge that, of course, there are barriers to exercising these existing laws and policies. We all know that to be true. There are significant externalities. The folks who are responsible for a lot of these local sources, whether it's SOx or NOx or nutrient runoff, are not the ones that are actually experiencing the harm, like Taylor Hatchery or Whiskey Creek Hatchery. So we have a classic tragedy of the commons, and the idea is how can you resolve that tragedy? Similarly, there's a lot of uncertainty, as Dick certainly explained, about what's going to happen to the marine ecosystem food web, and how long do we really have, and it may be devastating for Bill Dewey, but for the rest of us, it may not be our generation. And that uncertainty means that we have very different discount rates, and they lead us to inaction now. Also, we have really strong vested interests, folks that don't want to see a change in how we are deploying these laws and policies. If you think about agriculture, for example, and the petrochemical industry, but also our state and national agencies, we get really used to how we do business. And it's a whole other thing to think about a major adjustment and thinking about tackling ocean acidification with these old tried and true tools that we've typically used in a very different context. And finally, our budget priorities may not militate towards dealing with ocean acidification unless we're in a state like Washington, where we have Bill Dewey knocking on our door. So to address those, we argue that acting at a local scale makes tons of sense, because you can start to close that loop on the tragedy of the commons, and you have your own community suffering the ills of ocean acidification. If you can develop more measurements and understanding and reduce the uncertainties, as the state of Washington is doing in Puget Sound, you have more reason to act now, because you understand that the potential harm is much greater than others might argue who don't have the facts in front of them. And also, by bringing different parties together who typically don't spend a lot of time together, as they're doing in the state of Washington with the Blue Ribbon Panel, you can start cutting across those vested interests and getting people talking so that they're willing to take action together. And finally, with the work that Scott Doney and Sarah Cooley have been doing, where you're starting to put real numbers, as Bill Dewey did today, on the cost of ocean acidification, and play that out at the local level, you have a very strong argument for action. So in summary, I just want to underscore that we certainly have a lot of work to do on CO2, and there are terrific local and regional and state examples of folks tackling CO2 at a local level, whether it's AB 32 in California, the similar law in the state of Massachusetts, the fine work in King County, Washington, to reduce CO2 emissions through local action, through land use decisions, through restoration. But we also have a lot of laws at hand that can work on these local drivers that are so important in places like Puget Sound, Chesapeake Bay, Casco Bay. And the time is now to deploy them and get to work while others try to resolve the global CO2 problem. Thank you so much. And that long URL actually is the manuscript for the law review article, which will be published in the Harvard Environmental Law Journal in February of next year. Thanks.
So I'm Scott Doney. I'm a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and I unfortunately have the task of trying to wrap up this wonderful panel. And I was going to look a little bit more at some of the things that the research community can do moving forward to support stakeholders and decision makers. And so the first thing I wanted to touch on was the social and economic impacts. I think unfortunately when we establish research priorities, we often put these at the very end of the list. You know, it's basic research, and then it works its way down, and then we always put, well, yes, and we need to deal with how this affects people, and it kind of ends up at the bottom of the list. And unfortunately, lists often get prioritized from top to bottom. And I think here we have to flip that over and really put people first, because it's where acidification is affecting people and their livelihoods and jobs where I think we're getting the most traction in order to figure out solutions to some of these problems, as has been talked about by Bill and Dick and Meg. We've talked a lot so far about aquaculture and the example of the Pacific Northwest in terms of both food supply, jobs, livelihoods. We haven't talked as much about coral reefs. Acidification has very substantial impacts on corals. So it's not just the corals themselves, but it's the entire reef that they support, which can impact fisheries, but also tourism and recreation. And particularly for a lot of developing countries, coastal and island nations, it's that the tourism and recreation dollars that are some of the biggest components of their national economies. And we're not going to, just because of the composition of the panel, we're not going to touch on that in detail, but I just wanted to raise that very important point, that it's not just shellfish. Coral reefs are also very vulnerable to acidification. So one of the misnomers is we often think of fisheries as the total amount of catch. And so I'm showing here on the right the U.S. catch broken down into shellfish, which is that fairly small orange triangle, and then finfish, which is the big triangle, the rest of the circle. But the value of the shellfish is quite high. So pound for pound, shellfish generate a lot more revenue. And if you actually break down the U.S. fish catch by the value that different species bring, shellfish bring in about half the total value of U.S. catch. And so the fact that shellfish appear to be a relatively small part of the fishery sector is actually a little misleading, because in terms of economic impact, it's the value that's brought in. And if you look in particular and look at key species that might be sensitive to acidification, we've been talking some about oysters, but others, sea scallops are a very large industry, lobster and shrimp are the three largest of these shellfish. Most of these are wild catch, and so there are different problems between aquaculture-based and wild catch. There will probably be different adaptation strategies where aquaculture can go down certain routes that we can't do for wild harvest fisheries. But we do have some very large wild harvest fisheries that may be quite susceptible to ocean acidification. And was also mentioned by other species, or other speakers, sorry. Anyway, I won't go there. Several of the other big value fisheries in the U.S. feed off of calcifying organisms. So Dick pointed out the example of the Pacific salmon. The other is, for example, halibut, menhaden, and pollock. In terms of where this is distributed, this really is spread all around the coastal counties of the U.S. So this plot is just showing where the employment centers are, broken down by county around the U.S. And you see it really is widely distributed. And each of these communities is going to be affected in a different way, both because they're depending upon a different fish species or a different catch approach, but also because of the different social and economic conditions of those particular communities. And I think one of the areas of research that we need to pursue is not just looking at what's going to happen to individual fish species, but how is that going to affect communities? We don't have enough information yet on the sensitivity and the resilience of individual communities, and we need to combine research on looking at individual fish species and fisheries, also with what's going on the land in terms of these coastal communities. This second slide is just showing a slightly different variation of that, which is looking at the specialization. And you see that, if I can go back, there are some places where you have both a high number of jobs, but also that is the basic core of the economy. So, for example, you can see some of the coastal communities in Oregon and Washington, where a very large fraction of the local economy is based in some form or another on seafood harvesting or processing. I didn't put in a slide, but we should also remember that in terms of seafood, imports are quite dramatic. A large fraction of the seafood that we eat in the U.S. is actually imported. And so if we're thinking about the larger economy of wholesalers, processors, retailers of fish, and also the benefits that people derive from eating seafood, we also need to think of this as a global problem, because a lot of our fish are actually coming in large container ships, not coming from local boats. And we've started to do some work looking in particular at the mollusk and shellfish industries globally, and this is just a synthesis plot where we tried to put together where might be the most vulnerable places. So the countries that are in blue are the net exporters of shellfish. So, for example, you see India, Indonesia, China are all places with large surplus production of shellfish, a lot of domestic consumption, but also export, providing jobs and also trade dollars. And then the oranges and reds are countries that are importing shellfish. So you see a lot in Africa. The U.S., of course, is an importer. The shading suggests what we think are the sensitivity of these countries to ocean acidification. It's a combination of where we're seeing the largest changes in chemistry, but also where are the countries that are most dependent upon either exports or imports for food and trade dollars, and what is their ability to adapt in terms of their economic resources, education levels, basically the resilience of their society to perturbations. Similar sorts of maps could be done for coral reef ecosystems, and as we develop more information on other finfish, we could do similar types of analyses. But I think this really highlights, particularly for the tropical nations, island and coastal nations, where we think at a global scale the largest sensitivities are. So that's sort of the social and economic side. I did want to just highlight that there are some real research challenges on the natural science side as well. In particular, Dick showed this plot, this idea that there might be cascading food web impacts. So even if, for example, Pacific salmon aren't directly affected by acidification, if the prey that they depend upon are sensitive, they're going to be affected. You can think of Pacific salmon a lot like fishermen. If there's nothing there to catch, and in this case, if there's nothing there for the Pacific salmon to eat, then that fishery will collapse, and then it will of course cascade up to commercial fisheries. The other area, and Dick alluded to this, is there's some rather worrisome data coming out on some tropical fish species where researchers in Australia have been looking at how changing carbon dioxide and changing acidity affects the behavior of fish. And this is just an experiment with a clownfish, the little plastic tube. They can put the fish in the tube, and then they can put different odors in the different channels and see where does the fish like to spend time. And what they found was that under high CO2, fish aren't able to distinguish the smell of predators versus non-predators. And they've gone out and done experiments in the wild where they've done the same thing on little coral reefs. And what they find is under high CO2, these larvae get eaten at a dramatic rate. Their inability to detect a predator leads to a very high mortality rate. And they've actually been able to trace down the reason for this, and it has to do with a particular neurotransmitter in the fish brain, that under high CO2, they have to adjust their acid-base chemistry, and suddenly neurons in their brain that used to be inhibitory, they used to basically damp activity, now are just firing like crazy. And so what's concerning to me about this, and this is one of these new discoveries that's sort of percolating up, is this same type of neurotransmitter exists in almost every vertebrate brain. So it's really a question, they may have done this for clownfish, but this may have much broader implications. And so we really are, for some things, still in the discovery mode. We're still finding effects. And I'm not trying to be doom and gloom, but there may be aspects of this story that aren't well fleshed out yet. So how can we look forward to the future? This is some work that the NOAA Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab has been doing, where they've been taking predictions of climate change, reduced oxygen in the ocean, and looking at the impacts that might have on fish catch. When they add ocean acidification, it looks like this. This is still at the very nascent stage, so there might be fairly large error bars on this, but it does look like we also need to consider not just acidification by itself, not just climate change by itself, but these effects together because they have synergistic and additive effects. Basically, we need to look at it as a multi-stressor problem. In terms of solutions, some of this has already been talked about. We've been talking about the state of Washington. There's another effort going on along the whole California current of really trying to bring together a network of scientists and stakeholders. Their first priority has been to develop a monitoring program. And I think one of the issues we're still struggling with is, unlike other environmental problems, we don't have a long time history of making some of these measurements in the ocean, both in terms of the chemistry and the biological impacts. And as we've seen from Bill Dewey's talk, it's really putting some of that monitoring in place where we can start to identify problems perhaps ahead of time, or as problems start to crop up, being able to diagnose what is the underlying mechanism. So I think this is a very important area of interplay and interaction between the scientific community and stakeholder communities. And then finally, developing better decision support tools. This is just some proposed work that's moving forward for the New England sea scallop. The New England sea scallop fishery, a very large fishery out of New England, where we want to combine production models for sea scallops based on environmental conditions with chemistry models that bring in some of these interplays of carbon dioxide and nutrients and what the human impacts are on coastal waters, and then really feed that into an economic model so we can see for changes in future conditions, both what the harvest rate might be, but also what the impact might be on jobs and livelihoods within local communities. And here are some summary points. Many of these you've already seen. I just want to touch on the bottom one in terms of adaptation strategies, really reinforce this idea. We really need to put in better monitoring systems for ocean acidification, both the chemistry and the biology side. We need to work to reduce other regional and local stresses on the coastal ocean environment, and really moving forward on these scientist and stakeholder partnerships, both for what we can provide the stakeholders, but also to get a better sense from the stakeholders or what the questions they need answered. It's really a two-way dialogue we need to set up. And I'll stop there. Thank you.